The first hog entered the water without hesitation. Then another. Then all of them. The river was ordinary. That was the first thing anyone said afterward, and it was the thing that mattered most, not as a disclaimer, but as a foundation. The Cutter River, at the Aldred Crossing, had been a working river for as long as anyone on that stretch of the Ozark hill country had been there. It ran clear in summer, gray-green in spring flood, brown and slow in October drought. It had a ford at the Aldred property that was reliable in all but the worst of spring, wide and shallow, the bottom limestone, the banks gentle enough for livestock. The Aldred family had been watering animals at that ford for 20 years. Nothing had ever gone wrong there. Thomas Aldred was a careful man. 44 years old in the autumn of 1877, he had farmed this piece of the Ozark hill country since he was 20, had built the house and the barn and the east paddock himself, had learned the character of the land the way a man learned the character of land he intended to keep for the rest of his life, by paying attention to it over a long time. He knew the river. He knew what it did in flood and what it did in drought and what it did in the ordinary October weeks between. He had crossed it on foot and on horseback and with loaded wagons. He had let his livestock drink from it for 20 years. He trusted it the way you trusted something you had tested over a long time and found reliable. Thomas Aldred kept 6 hogs that season. Late October of 1877, the animals were ready for slaughter. Fat from the summer and the fall mast, in the good condition of pigs that had ranged freely through a productive year. He had been planning the slaughter for the following week. The 6 of them had been living in the east paddock, moved there from the main pen 3 days before. He let them into the yard that morning to range, the way he sometimes did in the last weeks. They had been in the east paddock, and he opened the gate, and they went into the yard, and he went back to the barn. He was in the barn when his daughter called to him. He came out. The hogs were at the river. They were not running. That was what he noticed first, what everyone who heard the account focused on afterward, because it was the detail that removed the most obvious explanation. A hog fleeing something ran. A hog chased by a dog or a predator moved the way spooked animals moved. Fast, erratic noise. Hogs were not quiet animals. They communicated distress loudly and continuously. These were not running. They were walking, single file with a steadiness that Thomas had never seen in hogs. Not the shuffling, rooting progress of pigs crossing ground they found interesting, and not the fast, purposeful movement of animals that had found something they wanted. Something else. A steadiness that had the quality of resolution. Each animal behind the one in front, spaced at intervals, walking directly toward the river. He started toward them. He had been moving before he fully understood what he was doing. Moving the way a farmer moved toward livestock that was behaving unexpectedly, the automatic response of a man whose animals were going somewhere they should not go. He was walking fast, and then he was running. He was running because of the steadiness. That was what he felt before he understood what he was seeing. Hogs moved in particular ways. You spent 20 years with hogs, and you knew their movement vocabulary. This movement was not in the vocabulary. This was a steadiness he had not seen in hogs, an absolute linear quality, as if something had removed the usual noise and distraction and sideways interest from the animals and left only the direction. The nearest hog was already at the bank. It entered the water without breaking stride. No hesitation at the water's edge, no sniff at the surface, no the sideways glancing assessment that animals made before they entered water. It walked down the bank and into the ford and kept walking. The water was ordinary. The ford was 2 feet deep at its deepest point and 20 yards across. The limestone bottom was visible in the clear October water. There was nothing in the river that Thomas could see. The hog walked into the river. It did not splash. This was the detail that lodged in Thomas's mind and would not leave it. That the hog walked into the water, and the water did not respond the way water responded to an animal entering it. There was no disturbance at the entry point, no surge, no spreading ripple. The water accepted the animal and closed around it as if it had been expecting it. He was running now. He had seen hogs in water before. They were capable swimmers, could cross water when they needed to. But they entered with the exuberant disturbance of animals that found water interesting, with noise and splashing and the particular roiling surface of a large animal in motion through liquid. This was not that. There was a stillness about the entry that was wrong in the specific way that a thing was wrong when it violated what you understood about how the world worked. The second hog entered the water, then the third. He shouted. The sound crossed the yard and the field, and the hogs did not react to it. They continued. The fourth entered the water. The fifth. He reached the bank. The first hog was gone. He could see the bottom of the ford, the pale limestone, the slight wavering of the current over it. The depth that his animals had crossed hundreds of times, that had never been more than belly deep on a large hog. The first animal had been walking in water that should have been well below its body. He could not see it. The sixth hog reached the bank. He grabbed it, took it by the back leg, the way you caught a pig, and held it with both hands and pulled. The animal did not fight him. It did not squeal. It did not do any of the things a caught pig did, which was struggle and protest loudly and make catching it a contest. It simply continued in the direction it had been going, steadily, its leg pulling forward in his grip. And he found that he was holding the weight of an adult hog with both hands and being moved by it toward the water. He let go. He let go because he had felt, in the moment of holding the animal, something he had no name for, a quality in the resistance that was not the resistance of a living animal pulling against a restraint. Not muscle and will. Something more like momentum. Something that had been going in one direction for some time and was going to continue in that direction. And he was a man-sized obstacle in the path of it, and it was going to go around him or through him or simply wait until he stopped. He let go. The sixth hog walked into the ford and did not surface. He stood at the bank and looked at the river. The ford was empty. The limestone bottom was visible through the clear water, smooth and pale, undisturbed. The current moved over it the way the current always moved over it, the slight shimmer of shallow water in October light. There was no sign that anything had entered the water. No ripple still moving outward. No disturbance on the surface. No sound. Not the underwater sound of large animals moving through water. Not the thrashing that would have accompanied 6 hogs meeting depth beyond their footing. He stood at the bank for a long time. His daughter came to stand beside him. She was 14. She had been the one who called him, who had been in the kitchen and had seen the hogs moving and had known, with the instinct of someone who had grown up on a working farm, that it was wrong. She had called him from the barn, and then she had watched. And she had watched from the yard, and then from the field, and then from the bank. She stood beside him now and looked at the ford. She said nothing. He looked at her face. She was not crying. She was not afraid in the way he might have expected. Not the fear of a young person who had seen something disturbing. She had the expression of a person who had witnessed something and was trying to understand it, and who was beginning to realize that understanding was not available. He looked back at the river. 6 animals had walked into it. None had come up. The river moved past them the way it always moved. Ordinary. The same depth, the same color, the same small sounds of water over limestone. 6 hogs had walked into it. None of them had come up. He searched the river that afternoon. He started at the ford and worked downstream, the way you worked when something entered a river and you needed to find it. Checking the banks, the eddies behind the larger rocks, the bends where the current slowed and deposited things. He went a mile downstream. He found nothing. He sent his son upstream to check the opposite direction. The boy went half a mile and found nothing. The following day, Thomas came back with Owen Pruitt and a dragging line. A weighted rope, they walked along the bottom of the ford and downstream, the way you dragged for the drowned. They worked the ford for an hour and then the 100 yards below it. The rope found nothing. Thomas stood in the ford with the line in his hands and dragged it and felt the bottom. Limestone under his feet and limestone under the rope. He worked it methodically, the way he worked any problem that required patience, back and forth, overlapping passes, making sure he had covered every foot of the ford and then the stretch below it. At one point, in the center of the ford, the water looked darker. Not a shadow. The sky was clear. Not sediment, the limestone bottom was visible everywhere else. Just a patch, perhaps 3 feet across, where the water had a quality of depth that did not correspond to the depth that was there. He looked at it for a moment, and then continued dragging. When he came back over the same spot, it was gone. Ordinary water over ordinary limestone. He did not mention it to Owen. The rope caught on nothing. He and Owen stood in the ford together, and both held the line on the second pass. It caught on small rocks, on the occasional larger stone, on what might have been a submerged branch. It did not catch on anything that had the weight or resistance of a large animal. He pulled the rope from the water and looked at it. Clean rope. No hair. No blood. No sign of contact with anything that had been alive. He coiled the rope. He looked at Owen. Owen looked at the ford. Neither of them said what they were thinking. No carcasses. In Thomas's experience, in anyone's experience in the Ozark Hill Country, this was not how drowning worked. An animal that drowned in a river surfaced. It surfaced because the process of drowning produced gas, and gas rose, and the animal came up somewhere downstream, sometimes quickly, sometimes over days. But it came up. The river gave things back, eventually. The river gave nothing back. They searched for 3 days. The body of water downstream from the Aldred Ford was checked for a week. Neighbors walking the banks, watching. Nothing surfaced. Nothing appeared on the banks. Nothing was found in the eddies or the pools or the shallows. He stood in the river to his knees at the ford, in the cold October water, and looked at the bottom. Smooth limestone. The current moved past him the way it always moved. No trace of 6 large animals having passed through. He thought about what that meant physically, what it required for an animal to enter water without disturbing the surface. Water responded to intrusion by nature. A stone, a wading bird, a hand, anything entering water produced ripple. 6 large hogs had entered this water. The water had not been disturbed. He stood in the ford and held that. There should have been something left. Not his own, but animals that had gone in during flood, that had been found downstream. He knew what the river did with things it took. It carried them. It deposited them in the places it deposited things, the bends, the shallows, the pools behind the larger rocks where the current slowed. He knew these places. He checked all of them. There was nothing. Not a carcass, not a piece of one. Not hair on a snag, not bone in a pool. He had expected something. Had gone into the search expecting something. because the absence of anything was harder to absorb than a body would have been. A body was an answer, even an incomplete one. A body said, "Here is where the animal ended." A body could be grieved and recorded and moved past. There was nothing to move past. There was nothing. If frontier mysteries like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. The morning after, Thomas went about the farm work the way he always did. He fed what remained of the animals. He checked the fence in the east paddock, the paddock from which, yesterday, the hogs had walked to the river. The fence was intact. Nothing had entered through it. The ground inside was the ground of the paddock, normal ground. There was no evidence in the paddock that anything had been wrong there. He stood in the empty east paddock and looked at the place where the hogs had been sleeping the previous night. Ordinary ground. He went back to the barn. He thought, in the days that followed, about the ordinariness of everything around the event. The paddock had been ordinary. The morning had been ordinary. The yard was ordinary. The river looked ordinary. Only the event itself had not been ordinary. Only the 20 minutes from when his daughter called him to when the 6th animal entered the water and did not surface. Outside those 20 minutes, everything was the same as it had always been. He found this harder to hold than the event itself. The event was extraordinary and therefore outside the normal account of things. The ordinariness on either side of it was the part that kept him awake. The other animals refused the river. This was the second thing, distinct from the first, but connected to it in ways that Thomas could not articulate. His cattle, which had been watered at the ford for years, would not approach it. He drove them to the bank on the second day after the hogs, and they stopped 20 feet from the water's edge and would not be moved. He tried again on the third day. Same result. The cattle stood at the edge of the field nearest the river and oriented away from it. The way cattle oriented away from things they had decided they were not going to approach. His horse refused the ford entirely. He tried to ride it across on the 4th day, needing to reach the far bank, and the horse planted at the top of the bank with a quality of refusal he recognized as absolute. He got down and led it. Same response. He put a blindfold on it and led it. At the point where the ground sloped toward the bank, the horse simply stopped walking. Not in panic, not in the trembling fear of a spooked animal. Just stopped, the way an animal stopped when it reached a decision. He stood with the horse at the point where it had stopped, 20 feet from the bank, the top of the slope that led to the ford, and looked at the river. The river looked ordinary. He had been telling himself this for 4 days, and it kept being true, and it kept not helping. The river looked exactly as it had looked on the morning of October 14th, before the hogs went in. The same water, the same bottom, the same banks. Ordinary. The horse would not go to it. He stood beside the horse for a while. He thought about the hogs, about the quality of the movement he had witnessed, the steadiness of it, the linearity. He thought about the 6th hog's leg in his hands and the direction of the pull. He thought about the water closing around each animal without disturbance. He untied the horse. He stood beside it for a moment, his hand on its neck, feeling its breathing. The horse was calm now, away from the bank. It had not panicked at any point. That was the thing he kept returning to. It was not afraid the way animals were afraid of predators or fire or sudden loud sounds. It was not shaking, not sweating, not trying to flee. It was simply positioned 20 feet from the bank and not going further. He thought about the hogs again, about the difference between refusal and compulsion. The hogs had been compelled, had moved toward the river with the quality of animals doing something they had to do. The horse was refusing. was positioned away from something it had decided it could not approach. Two opposite movements, one toward and one away, both of them out of his understanding, both pointing at the same place. He went around by the upper ford, a mile upstream. The dog would not go to the river at all. Not to the ford, not to the bank downstream, not to the bank upstream. It avoided the river along its entire length where it bordered the Aldred property, detouring into the field rather than taking the riverbank path it had always used. He watched this and said nothing about it for several days. Then he told his wife. She had already noticed. In the weeks that followed, the river was quiet. Thomas's wife, her name was Cora, was a person with a precise relationship to words, someone who chose what she said carefully and meant it when she said it. The neighbors who came to hear the account often found themselves talking to Cora as much as to Thomas, because Thomas reported the events and Cora reported what the events felt like to inhabit. She said, "The river is the same river in the daytime. In the daytime, it looks right and sounds right, and I have no feeling from it that is different from any other October. At night, it sounds different." She described this more than once, to different people, in consistent terms. At night, after dark, when the house was quiet and the only sounds were the sounds of the farm and the hollow, the river sounded different, not louder or quieter, not faster or slower. Different in quality, the way a sound was different when the thing making it had changed in some way you could not see. She had lived beside this river for 17 years. She knew what it sounded like at night. She said, "It sounds like it's thinking about something." I know how that sounds. In the weeks that followed, the river was quiet, not audibly quiet. It ran at its October level and made the sounds it made. But there was a quality to it that Thomas's wife described, to a neighbor who came to hear the account, as wrong. Not frightening, just not right. The particular quality of something that looked exactly as it should and sounded exactly as it should, and was somehow neither of those things. She said, "When I go past the ford, the water sounds different. Not different in a way I can name. Different in the way a familiar voice sounds different when the person is standing in a room they are not usually standing in." The neighbor looked at her. She said, "I know how that sounds." The neighbor said nothing. Thomas came to rely on the upper ford for all crossings. He carried water from the upper ford for the animals through November, rather than driving them to the river. It was more work. He did not propose an alternative. In December, the first hard freeze locked the river. Thomas walked across it to the far woodlot on foot, the ice solid underfoot, and felt nothing unusual. When the thaw came in March and the river was open again, he brought the cattle to the ford. They stopped at 20 feet. The following summer was dry. By August, the creek that fed the east paddock was gone, and the well was low, and the heat had been on for 6 weeks without real relief. The animals needed water, and the most accessible water was the Cutter River at the Aldred Ford. Thomas drove the cattle to the ford every day for a week, trying. They would not drink from it. He watched them stand at 20 feet from the bank, lowing in the heat, refusing to approach the water that was 50 yards away. He tried different times of day: early morning, when the animals were most thirsty; midday, when the heat was highest and the refusal would cost them most; evening, when they had had a full day of wanting water and had not had it. They would not go to the river. He hauled water from the upper ford in barrels for the rest of the summer. 2 trips a day in the worst of it, each trip a mile upstream and a mile back with a loaded wagon. The work added 3 hours to every day that already had too many hours in it. He hired a neighbor's boy for the hottest weeks. He wore out 2-barrel hoops that season. He told no one it was because the cattle wouldn't drink from the ford. He told them the wagon was easier. This was not untrue. The upper ford had better access for a loaded wagon. It was not the reason. It was considerable work. He did not complain about it, at least not in ways that reached anyone outside the family. He simply did the work. His neighbor Owen, who knew him well, asked once, "Do you think you'll sell the property?" Thomas was quiet for a while. He said, "I don't think the property is wrong. I think the river is different now than it was. I think whatever happened in October changed something about that water, and the animals understand the change, and they're not going back until the change is resolved." Owen said, "Do you think it will resolve?" Thomas looked at the river. He was quiet for a while. He said, "I think about that word. Resolved. What it would mean in this context. A river that took 6 animals and returned nothing. What does resolution look like for that? The animals coming back is not possible. An explanation is possible, but I don't have one, and don't expect to have one. The animals coming back to the ford is possible and may happen when there are animals that have no knowledge of it. But I don't know if that's resolution or just time passing." Owen was quiet. He said, "I don't know what resolved means in this situation." He thought about selling the property. He did not sell it. He did not come close to selling it. He was not a man who walked away from things because they had become difficult. And the farm was sound, the land was good. The difficulty was specifically and only the river. The river was 300 yards from the house. You could live with a river being wrong. You carried water from the upper ford, and you avoided the lower ford, and you went on with the rest of it. But he thought about it. He thought about it in the August drought, when the cattle were suffering in the heat, and the upper ford was a mile away, and the lower ford was 50 yards, and might as well have been 100 miles. He thought about it in those long, hot evenings, when he sat on the porch and looked at the river through the tree line and thought, "Ordinary. It looks ordinary." He did not sell. People came to hear the account, not in a dramatic way, not as spectators to a spectacle, but in the manner of the Ozark hill country, which was careful and practical. Word moved from farm to farm, and the people who heard it and had questions came to Thomas at their own time, and he told them what had happened. He told it the same way every time. The gate, the barn, his daughter calling, the hogs at the river. The steadiness of the walk, the entry without splash, the 6th hog's leg in his hands, and the pull of it, the bank after, and the ford, and the empty water. Most people listened without offering theories. This was not lack of interest. It was the quality of listening that people in the hill country brought to things they could not explain, which was to hear it fully, and then to hold it without forcing it into a frame. Some people offered theories. None of them accounted for the absence of splash. And when Thomas pointed this out, the theories fell quiet. One person said, "The river took them." Thomas looked at the person. He said, "Yes, that is what I'm telling you." The person meant something more specific by "the river took them" than Thomas was meaning. And they both knew it, and neither of them pushed further. There are things that are best left at the edge of language, where naming them would make them smaller than they are. Thomas left it there. He never found an explanation. He thought about it in the way that a practical man thought about inexplicable things. Persistently, methodically, arriving at conclusions and discarding them when they failed to account for all the facts. He went through the possibilities the way he went through any farm problem. Identify the evidence, assess the theories, eliminate what didn't fit. The evidence was, 6 hogs walked into the ford without being driven, without showing distress, without splashing, without surfacing. The evidence was no carcasses found in 3 days of searching a river known to return its drowned. The evidence was all other animals on the property refused the river site permanently, without being trained to do so, including animals that had used that ford for years. He eliminated predator. There was no predator that caused hogs to walk voluntarily into water. He eliminated sickness. Sick animals did not behave in the organized, sequential, calm manner the hogs had behaved. He eliminated flooding. The river had been at ordinary October level. He eliminated the many other explanations that people offered him over the following months, which were various and well-intentioned, and none of which accounted for the fact that the hogs had not splashed. He could not eliminate what he had seen. He could not explain it. He had been a practical man his whole life, and he remained practical about this. Practical did not mean dismissive of what he could not explain. Practical meant account for all the evidence. The evidence did not support any explanation he could construct. Therefore, he had no explanation. This was an uncomfortable place to sit, but it was an honest one, and he preferred honest discomfort to the dishonest comfort of a theory that left evidence out. He told people this when they pressed him for a theory. He said, "I have no theory that accounts for all of it. I have seen things I cannot explain. I have told you what I saw. That is what I have." This was not a satisfying answer. He knew it was not a satisfying answer. The people who asked him wanted the answer to be satisfying, and some of them were frustrated when it was not, as if the failure of explanation were a kind of negligence on his part. He could not help them. He had been there. He had seen it. He was the man with the most evidence, and the most evidence had not produced an explanation. He went on. He told the account plainly to the people who asked, and he left it as a thing that had happened and had no resolution. This was not comfortable. He was a man who resolved things. Farms required resolution. A problem identified was a problem addressed, and you did not leave problems sitting. This one sat. Cora outlived Thomas by 12 years. In her later years, she was asked about the October of 1877 by various people. People who had heard the account, people who were curious, a man from the county seat who was writing something about unusual events in the hill country. She told them what she had told everyone, the plain facts, as she had witnessed them, and as Thomas had described them to her. To the man from the county seat, who pressed her for what she thought had happened, she said something that she had been working toward for years. She said, "I think the river has things in it that aren't fish. Things that have been in moving water for a very long time, that are not animals in any way we would recognize. That the water carries the same way the water carries sediment, as part of its own nature. I think one of those things came to the surface, or came close enough to the surface to be felt, in October of 1877 at our ford. I think the hogs felt it. I think they understood what it was, or understood what it was calling, in a way that my husband and I could not." The man asked, "Do you think it called them to their deaths?" She thought about that. She said, "I don't know if death is the word for what the river does with things. I don't know if death is a concept that applies to what the river is and what it carries. I know my husband's hogs walked into it and did not come back. And I know the river looked ordinary afterward. And I know that when I listen to the river at night, I can still hear something that I cannot describe, and that was not there before October." She looked at the man. "I think the river is alive in a way we don't have language for. I think it has always been alive. I think on that October morning it was paying attention. She stopped talking. The man wrote something down. She said, "I think that is enough." He farmed the property for 11 more years. The cattle eventually came back to the ford, not that season, not the next, but in the third year after the October of 1877, when a new generation of cattle had been introduced that had no memory of the event. They watered at the ford normally. The river did not take them. Thomas watched this from the bank the first time, standing at the edge of the water with his hands in his coat pockets, watching his new cattle drink. The water looked ordinary. He put his hand in it. Cold, clear October water, the limestone bottom visible beneath his palm. Ordinary. He stood at the ford for a long time. He had been standing at this bank in his mind for 3 years. Every time he passed it. Every time he looked at the river from the house or the barn or the road. 3 years of the ordinary-looking water that the animals had refused. 3 years of the ford that looked right and was not. The new cattle drank and lifted their heads and moved back to the field. He watched them go. He stood at the ford with his hand in the water for a long time. He was not sure what he was waiting for. Some quality in the water to change, some sign that whatever had been here 3 years ago was still here or was not. He felt nothing in the water but cold and current and the familiar texture of the limestone bottom under his palm. He thought about the 6th hog's leg, the pull of it, the momentum that had been going in one direction. He thought about whatever had made that momentum possible. He took his hand out of the water. He dried it on his coat. He looked at the ford one more time. At the ordinary water, the ordinary bottom, the ordinary October light on the surface. And he filed what he saw alongside what he knew, which did not resolve and was not going to resolve. And he went back to work. The following October, Thomas found himself at the ford on the 14th. He had not planned to be there on that date specifically. He had been checking the fence along the river pasture and had worked his way to the ford and stopped. October 14th, a year to the day. The river looked the same. The ford looked the same. The limestone bottom was visible in the clear water. October light on the surface, the same angle he had seen it at on the same morning a year before. He stood at the bank for a while. He thought, if something comes, I will watch it. If something goes into the water, I will watch how it goes. Nothing came. The river ran ordinary. He walked back to the barn. He went back every October 14th for the remaining years he farmed the property. Standing at the bank, watching. Nothing ever came. The river was ordinary every time. He stopped going eventually, not because he had given up watching, but because he had understood, somewhere in those annual visits, that whatever had happened on October 14th, 1877, had happened once and was not going to happen again. The river was not a recurring threat. It was a place where something had happened once that could not be explained and had not happened since. He could live with that. What was not resolved, and what he did not find resolution for, was the question of what had taken the hogs. Not in the sense of an explanation. He had given up on explanation. In the sense of understanding. He had 6 animals walk voluntarily into a ford they had crossed dozens of times, enter the water without disturbance, and disappear completely from a depth that should have been well below their bodies. He had searched the river. He had dragged the ford. He had watched the banks for a week. Nothing. There should have been something left. He had been a farmer long enough to know that living things left evidence. They left tracks. They left waste. They left their own bodies when they died. The evidence of an animal's existence persisted in the ground and the water and the land around it, sometimes for years. 6 large hogs disappearing into a river left nothing. Not nothing in the sense of a mystery not yet solved. Nothing in the absolute sense. An absence. A place in the record where 6 animals had been and then were not. And the water that took them had given back nothing. No hair, no carcass, no blood, no trace. As if they had been removed from the account entirely. He thought about this for the rest of his life. He did not arrive at a conclusion. He simply knew that the Cutter River at the Aldred Ford had taken 6 of his animals on a clear October morning in 1877, in full view of himself and his daughter, in a way that defied everything he understood about how rivers and animals worked. And that the river, afterward, had looked exactly as it always had. Ordinary. The Aldred Ford is still there. The river still runs past it. The same water over the same limestone, the same depth in October, the same color. Thomas's son took over the farm in 1888. He had been 11 years old in October of 1877. Old enough to understand what had happened, young enough not to have been present for the event itself. He had grown up with the Ford as a place that was used and then not used, and then used again, with the gap in use explained to him plainly by his father, who never made more or less of it than it was. He farmed the land and used the Ford. He drove his own cattle there, a different generation of animals, and they drank without incident. He crossed on horseback without difficulty. He told the account to his own children, not as a warning, not as a story of loss, but as a fact about the property. The same way you told children about the place the fence had been taken down, or where the old barn foundation was. Here is what happened here. You should know. Subsequent generations farmed the Aldred land and used the Ford. No one reported anything like it again. But the animals still hesitated at the bank a moment longer than they should have. Not refusing, just pausing. The way an animal paused at the edge of something it was not quite sure of. Then drinking, then going. And, in certain seasons, when the water ran low and the limestone showed through clear, the Ford looked deeper than it had any right to be. Not dramatically, just slightly. The bottom visible but further down than the water level accounted for. The kind of thing you noticed and then looked at again and could not quite confirm. Most people learned not to look at it for long. Thomas Aldred's account survives in the written record because his daughter, who witnessed it, wrote it down in a letter to her cousin in 1891. She described the hogs entering the water. She wrote, "They did not try to turn back. There was no sound. I have tried to think of a reason for it for 14 years. I have not found one. I have stopped expecting to." She was not a frightened woman when she wrote the letter. She was 32, married, living in a different county. She wrote the letter because her cousin had heard a version of the account from someone else and had written to ask if it was true. She confirmed it was true. She gave the plain facts as she had seen them. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "My father never spoke of it with fear. He spoke of it the way he spoke of other things that had happened on the farm that he did not understand and could not change, with respect for the fact of it." She wrote, "I think that is the correct way to hold it. The river is still there. I drove past it last autumn. It looked the same as it has always looked. I stood at the bank for a few minutes and looked at the Ford. It looked ordinary. I have learned not to trust that. I think the ordinary appearance of things is not evidence of their ordinary nature. I think some places are more than they look, and the Cutter River at the Aldred Ford is one of them. I was 14 years old when I watched those hogs walk into the water. I am 32 now. Not a day has passed when I have not thought about the steadiness of the walk, the fact that they did not turn back, the fact that the water did not move when they entered. I have raised animals. I know hogs. I know what hogs do when they are frightened, when they are sick, when they are running towards something they want. What I watched in October of 1877 was none of those things. What I watched was animals that understood something I did not, and went toward it anyway. I think about that. I think about it a great deal. It happened. It is true. I do not know why. She wrote one more thing at the very bottom of the letter, in smaller writing than the rest, as if she had added it after she thought she was finished. Those who knew the river well learned not to stand too long at the edge of it. She crossed nothing out. She folded the letter and sent it. The letter was kept. The account survived.